Greetings from Microlab Northwest. We've talked about ash, we've talked about char. Both of those materials have characteristic structures that identify their source. Ash is the inorganic residue of complete combustion. It includes silica phytoliths, calcium oxalate phytoliths that have been thermally modified, and other materials that may not contain enough structure by themselves, but in association with other inorganic materials may actually show the outline of cells. Ash can help you identify the source of combustion. Very useful in the characterization of wildfire material. Char, on the other hand, is the result of incomplete combustion. Whereas ash is basically colorless, char is definitely black, or at least very dark. Most of the hydrogen is gone. The carbon that is left in the residue, the incompletely burned material, still carries the structure, the cell structure of the fuel source. So it's very useful in identifying, for instance, bark, leaf material, twig material, wood structure. It can be used to actually identify the material that burned, though incompletely. Soot is an entirely different material. It is, of course, black. But soot is the result of a process where a gas phase transfers directly to a particle phase. The initial products of this combustion process are quite small, on the order of a few nanometers, but they form in clusters. As they form, they become a nuclei for condensation of materials, the gas phase materials that don't completely burn. Many of these are polyaromatic hydrocarbons, and they are the source of the odors that we sense from the fire that has occurred. In the case of wildfire, soot is not very useful. The particles, the agglomerates of soot, tend to be quite small, submicron in size. They do contain some of the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and the other materials that give smoke its odor. Some of those will also condense in association with char particles. But the structure of the char is still there. We can still identify it. In the case of soot, that is not the case. In the case of soot, we simply have a black agglomerate, and those black agglomerates are small, and they tend to be widely dispersed. Soot is a regional contaminant and not necessarily associated with a particular source. That's why it's not very useful for identifying wildfire. It tells you you've got a combustion process, but it doesn't tell you what exactly was being burned. So soot's not useful in the case of wildfire exposure. Does that mean that soot's not important? Not at all. Soot is very important, but not from wildfire. The soot agglomerates that form from different fuel and combustion processes can tell you very interesting things. For instance, when you see a diesel truck or bus and it's starting, it's accelerating, and you see this black puff of smoke. That's soot. And that type of soot has some characteristic structure. Some of it is in the form of cenospheres. Cenospheres identify the fact that you are being exposed to emissions from a diesel type engine, a system in which the liquid fuel is injected into a hot chamber where it is combusted, in the case of diesel, by compression and elevated temperature. In other conditions, like for instance, in an oil-fired boiler, the particles of fuel are injected into a hot environment and they burn there. And they burn in a way that creates identifiable soot. The identifiable soot is only a small part of the total amount of soot that even that kind of combustion releases. Much of the material that's released is what we call dry soot. Dry soot, of course, isn't really a question of whether or not it has moisture in it. It's a question of how much hydrocarbon is condensed in the material, in these agglomerates that form. With a diesel engine properly tuned, there is very little hydrocarbon that are in these particles. They tend to be essentially well combusted. But in an uncontrolled fire, like a structure fire, that's not the case. These soot agglomerates that form in a structure fire or in any kind of uncontrolled combustion of a liquid, we can get fairly large soot agglomerates, and these soot agglomerates can also give us an idea of the conditions under which the fuel was burned. If the fuel is burned in a fairly small fire, or a fire that has limited size, then the soot agglomerates, as it leaves the region of combustion, cools very rapidly, and the gases that would have converted to soot, would have converted to particles of carbon, instead condense around those particles that did combust to that point. These soot agglomerates can be quite large. The amount of combusted material, that is condensed material, that make up these agglomerates will give you an idea of the conditions under which that fire occurred. We've all seen images of homes that were burned as a result of a wildfire. When you look at those homes, what remains is not black. It's ash. When a home burns from the outside in, there's plenty of oxygen, and the combustion process is fairly efficient, resulting in the total destruction of the home. On the other hand, when the fire is inside the home, it rapidly uses up all the oxygen that's available. And the result is that you have a lot of these condensable hydrocarbons that form these soot agglomerates. Now, soot agglomerates, if they have a lot of hydrocarbon condensed around them, are very sticky. They have a high sticking coefficient, and that means that they tend to adhere to the first surface they impact. If the fire is more efficient, burns more of these materials, then they will travel further. They have a lower sticking coefficient. They may impact a couple of surfaces before they finally stick or settle onto a surface. That we can see with a light microscope. If the material has very little condensed hydrocarbon, then the particle, like from a gas fireplace, will quite often form as little plates, little flat sheets, as a result of their compacting on the surface of the chimney or the fire chamber. And they accumulate over time, and most of the hydrocarbons are gone. It's primarily carbon. Not completely. May still have quite a bit of hydrogen there, but most of it's carbon. If we look at a fire where the liquid fuel is consumed in a fairly large chamber where the dwell time at high temperature is long, then most of that material will be completely consumed except for the residual carbon that makes up the structure. We see that, for instance, in a boiler that burns bunker C fuel. We end up with very interesting structures from that kind of thing, including soot particles in the form of cenospheres. They're kind of like the cenospheres that will come out of a diesel engine, only out of the diesel engine, the cenospheres tend to be very small, typically 10 microns or smaller, occasionally a bit larger. But for a bunker C system, the cenospheres that come out of that can be 50 microns. And they tend to be very lacy. They have a lacy structure. And that again is characteristic of this tarry type of fuel, bunker C, which is basically residuum from a refinery. When we look at things that have burned in a home, we have tars, we have paints, we have a variety of things that produce the gas phases that are going to make up the soot. And many of these gas phases are very demanding in oxygen. The result is that they deplete the oxygen and they form these polyaromatic hydrocarbons and similar kinds of things that then condense in with the soot, the individual carbon particles that were the result of this initial combustion when oxygen was more plentiful. These materials become the VOCs, that is the volatile organic compounds, and the semi-volatile volatile organic compounds that give us the odor that we smell from the fire. In most cases, these materials will condense around the carbon that is formed in the combustion process. Some of those gas phases will go further and may condense out on other surfaces, but much of that material actually condenses around the carbon soot nuclei. So when we go to a fire site, quite often if we want to know what the precursor was, we'll collect the soot particles, the soot agglomerate particles, and we'll extract those and we'll analyze the materials that can be extracted by solvents in order to identify what the major fuel might have been. There are some problems with that too, but we won't go into that right now. The key point is that much of the materials that give the odor of the fire are actually in the particles. If you remove the particles, generally you remove the odor. That is certainly the case with wildfire particulate, as long as you're not right in the near field of the fire. But it's not the case with things like a house fire, because the house, by definition, is within the near field. So you'll have a lot of materials that condense out on surfaces other than just the soot particles. So soot is important when we're analyzing the products of combustion. It is not important when we're looking at wildfire. Every single sample you collect from an environment with a tape lift will have soot. Soot is ubiquitous. It's analyzed out of ice cores in glaciers in Antarctica, glaciers in Greenland. It is everywhere. It has many, many different sources. It's a regional contaminant, not a site-specific contaminant, except in the case of a structure fire. Soot is important in structural fires, and as you can see, particles become more transparent on a tape lift depending on how much organic material has actually been condensed within the soot agglomerate. These soot agglomerates from a local fire can be quite large. They can be hundreds of microns in diameter. Matter of fact, they will float around as little black balloons when you're burning something like asphalt or tar. These will float around. As soon as they hit a surface, they tend to stick because the surface is sticky with all of these condensed hydrocarbons. As you go further away from that source, the agglomerates become smaller and they become darker. Soot is important, but primarily for the characterization of structure fires or fires other than wildfires. Well, that brings us through the combustion process, combustion particles, char, ash, very diagnostic of wildfires. Soot, not useful for wildfires, but very important in identifying other combustion sources. We have cenospheres from diesel engines. We have these exotic lacy structures or icicles coming out of bunker C combustion. We have little balloons that, when they're collected on a tape lift, have fairly light centers and dark edges, because as the balloon collapses, we get a thick layer of carbon at the edge, but just the thin layers that were the surface of the balloon in the center of the structure. We see that here. There's a lot more that we could go into in talking about combustion, but we won't do that here. We'll look at some other sources. We'll talk a bit more about combustion, but not in this video. Thank you very much, and that will complete this brief discussion of soot, char, and ash analysis. See you next time.